If you want to succeed in mixed martial arts, or MMA, there's only one place where you can find fortune, fame, and legacy. This is why they fight outside the octagon, to take the gold of the UFC. This is the biggest moment of your career as a fighter. In 2022, the UFC recorded a new record of $387 million in earnings. I'm going for the money piece of, while they cut the payment to fighters at $32.8 million. I drive for Uber. I participate in some jiu-jitsu tournaments to help me. So what did the fighters do about it? A collective demand not only provided valuable information about the finances of the UFC, but also an opportunity for their athletes to change the dynamics between them forever. But as you will see throughout this video, the UFC always wins. Don't you like how we pay our fighters? What a shame. When it was under the ownership of SUFA, the UFC operated as a private company, hiding much of its financial transactions in secret. However, with a new administration and, in the midst of a collective demand, this information became public. But the debate is over. We have legal documents year after year with the express intention, written in plain language by the UFC, which says, we want to keep it at approximately 20%. According to the demand, the UFC owns approximately 90% of the national and international market in the MMA. This gives them incredible control over the salaries within that market, as it limits the potential growth of any new promoter. In 2019, another demand showed that even if Bellator allocated all its income to the payment of fighters, it could only pay half of the average salary of the UFC. Meanwhile, salaries only represent around 20% of the UFC's spending, which makes it impossible to compete against them. To further widen the gap between the UFC and other promoters, Dana counter-programmed. When Affliction organized its first pay-per-view event, Dana programmed champion Anderson Silva to knock out James Irving on open television and ruin Affliction's numbers. The UFC didn't like us getting into the business of MMA. In reality, we weren't looking to compete with them. We just wanted to sell some t-shirts and everything was going well until it became a competition. And then, things started to crumble. Now we are facing a shark and we are golden fish. Today, the UFC has 88% of the 10 best fighters in the world in all divisions and 74% of the 25 best, which makes it impossible for anyone to find the necessary competition to be classified as number one without signing with the UFC. Dana said it himself. Anyone who thought they could compete was stupid. Do you know what we should do? We should get a couple more pilots and start our own racing league and compete with a NASCAR. Does anyone want to join me? Of course they don't. It sounds like the stupidest idea in the world, but people think they can do it with the UFC. If a promoter grew too much, Dana would buy her. If she couldn't buy her, she would buy her talent. And if she couldn't buy her talent, she would use her platform to devalue them ferociously. And then I'm hearing nonsense. That the reason why she went to the UFC is because, hey, she heard that I wanted her to go to the World Series of Fighting. I don't care where she goes. And then she went and beat Fabricio Werdum. She lost against Werdum. She lost against Werdum, she lost against Silva, and she lost against Dan Henderson. They come to my Twitter saying, oh, you disrespect the best fighter of all time. Listen, you have been living the myth for too long. To understand the situation in which UFC fighters are today, we need to examine the experience of the boxers of decades ago and the infamous deals of Don King. Hey, Don, why did you steal Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali like Barack Obama stole us? Because I loved them. I loved them and I thought it was so beautiful that they gave me the opportunity to make them rich, to be able to steal them because they were poor when they came to me one day, and there was nothing to steal. Among Don King's many shady deals was the control he exercised over the title belts, both as a promoter and as a manager. If one of his boxers became a champion, King insisted that any boxer who wanted to fight his champion should first sign under his management, which effectively granted him the rights to promote any future world title in that division. This suppressed the salaries of the boxers and forced them to sign coercive contracts that gave most of their money to King. With my black brother, he's just a bad man. He's a really bad man. He mistreated you and then discarded you. He would kill his mother for $1. To put an end to this, the Ali Law was passed, which by law separated world titles and promoters, which meant that world titles became independent organizations, such as the WBO and the WBA. In theory, boxers can climb the rankings of these organizations to become mandatory contenders, and then the promoters compete to see who organizes the fight. The income is theirs, not mine. I lend a service. I shouldn't own the income that Anthony Joshua generates in a fight. Why should I? As a new and separate sport, MMA is not subject to these same restrictions, which means that they can own both the world title and exclusive rights over any fighter on their squad. Dana White even used to represent fighters like Tito Ortiz, but no longer does so due to the obvious conflict of interests. Even so, Dana develops relationships with other representatives and promoters so that they act as intermediaries when signing new talents, and nobody wants to see themselves as a development league for the UFC. Accept it. All of you are development leagues for the UFC, okay? Let's take as an example the president and owner of Cage Warriors, Graham Boylan. Boylan is not only the owner of a promoter that distributes his own titles, he also represents fighters within that same promoter. And as expected, the fighters that Boylan often represents become Cage Warriors champions, and then are promoted as such once they sign with the UFC. One could assume that this relationship between Boylan and the UFC would at least benefit the fighter. However, even important names under the representation of Boylan, like Paddy Pimblett, still sign minimum contracts of $12,000 to appear and $12,000 to win. So, why do fighters even bother signing with representatives? They say, no, the UFC wants Sean O'Malley. I'm going to go with his representative. His representative takes 20%, 15% to tell me about the deal, not to do anything. Hey, UFC called. Do you want to make this deal? And I say, of course. If a fighter's from the United Kingdom, their best chance of the UFC noticing him is to sign with Cage Warriors. In fact, more than 95% of all British fighters who are currently in the UFC have ever been signed with Cage Warriors. And what is the best way to enter Cage Warriors and fight for a title? Have your president, Graham Boylan, as a representative. Well, the other part is that the representative ends up acting as a doorman to the UFC, where the fight organizers then look at the representative as saying, show me what you have. In exchange for signing new talents with economic contracts, Dana White and the UFC broadcast the Cage Warriors events on Fight Pass and promote the affiliate organization on their Instagram page, which increases the popularity and income of Cage Warriors, making it a much more successful company for Graham, without doing something as obvious as giving him a check for all the fighters who sign with a great discount. For example, in boxing, you can't be a representative and promoter at the same time. You can't. And that's the problem I mentioned last week with Graham Boylan, who represents all these fighters, signs them with Cage Warriors, signs them with his representation team, and then channels them to the UFC. However, not only Cage Warriors in the United Kingdom are trapped in the stranglehold of the UFC. Many countries have a similar dynamic, with a main regional event that acts as its channel to the UFC. But what are the arguments in favor of the UFC? After all, fighters still earn more than the average person, and they only fight a couple of times a year, right? So this is what a UFC fighter earns compared to the average American citizen. However, it is important to remember that fighters have the same expenses as anyone else, but they also pay for coaches, sparring partners, nutritionists, physiotherapists, and other costs associated with being a professional athlete. And the reports of the sports regulator lawyer Eric McGracken show that the average UFC career lasts between 31 and 41 months. And since there is no retirement plan in the UFC, his bag must last not only that year, but the rest of his life. And it's something I told my husband, like everyone loves you when you're in the ring or in the octagon and you're fighting, but some of those people will be there for you, or they won't even think about you a second a day when you're 90 years old and you're still dealing with everything you've done. But what about all the promotional momentum that fighters receive? Alex Pereira's career received great momentum, going from debutant to champion in just 12 months. Although this momentum is real for some athletes, many chain long win streaks just to never get the chance to fight for a title. Not only does the amount of support that each fighter receives vary enormously, but sometimes it is difficult to see how certain press days can be considered an absolute promotion. But does all this take into account the bonuses? I mean, we've all heard about the costume bonuses that are given to fighters after backstage for good performances, right? You won the award for the performance of the night. Me? You won the performance of the night. Yes! Wow. You won the fighter of the night. No way. I swear to God. Are you serious? I'm talking, bro. You won 50,000. You're lying. I swear to God. You're lying to us. No, I swear to God. What? Well, the payment of 20% of the salary revealed by the anti-monopoly lawsuit actually includes many of these bonuses. And the fighters argue that the bonuses do not even cover what they should be receiving in the first place. The companies are growing and are implementing other small, stupid bonuses. $5,000 here, $5,000 there, $50,000, man. We have been stuck in this for 20 years. Despite this, don't high-level fighters make a lot of money? Why should a preliminary fighter that no one has heard of make more money than he generates? Well, the UFC's distribution agreement with ESPN means that they have to organize a certain number of events each year. These events must include many fights to allow enough time for advertising ads. This means that they have to include smaller fights throughout the night. What is the value of a fighter? An individual fighter has almost no value, generally, because they are very, very interchangeable. But together, we know their value is at least $300 million for ESPN. Or you are in the transmission and we sell ads around that, or you are not. And that is simply the difference. But if UFC fighters are so upset about the payment, why don't they fight or wait for their contract to end and go somewhere else? Even if the promoters had the means to pay the average fighter more, UFC contracts make it very difficult to leave. These contracts allow the UFC to add extension clauses, such as extending the contract for 6 months if a fighter rejects or cannot accept a fight. It allows them to freeze the contract indefinitely in case of withdrawal or injury. Not only does the average contract last longer than the average career, but also the UFC has a year to match any offer made to a fighter once their contract ends. All this makes leaving the UFC not only financially difficult, but also harmful to a fighter's athletic window of competition. So, when it was announced that not only the fighters had been successful in filing a collective lawsuit against the UFC, but that the judge was publicly expressing his support for them, hope was on the horizon. The fighters were about to change not only the UFC, but the panorama of MMA forever. But then everything stopped abruptly. The UFC and the plaintiffs, a group of fighters in a collective lawsuit, have reached an agreement. Yes. In March 2024, the fighters and their representatives agreed on an agreement for $335 million. The agreement establishes a cash payment of a total of $335 million to a liquidation fund of the UFC. Although this is a lot of money, it is short compared to the $4,500 million they could have received if they had gone to trial. But what I would say is that this is a very, very, very dark day for all sports, and in particular for its most vulnerable participants. The reason why this sum does not represent a great victory for the fighters is because they had the opportunity to change everything. And once the money from the agreement is distributed, many will find their disappointing part, considering what was at stake. There are approximately 1,200 fighters who could have received money, and some will receive more than others. But on average, there are about 280,000 per fighter, less than 30% in total. We can calculate, in fact, another simple way is to combine all the income you generated during the main period as a fighter and take around 22 or 23% of that. That should be the amount of your compensation for that section. Apart from the payment and a few temporary amendments to the contract that should only be fulfilled during the next 5 years, the UFC managed to close its doors to future agreements. You have to give up the opportunity to join any future collective demand. If a union is not established, or if the Ali law does not end up extending to MMA from boxing, the payment to the fighters will continue to be what it is for the foreseeable future. Without a regulatory intervention in a space that, relatively speaking, is not as regulated as mixed martial arts, it is not possible to compete with the UFC. They have achieved a status of monopoly multiplied by 1 billion. You can't touch them. It is not possible to compete with them. It seems that the UFC is incredibly close to achieving the business of the century, monopoly and monopsony on the sport of fastest growth in the world, for $335 million. So why did the fighters accept? Well, technically, they could have lost the case and not receive anything. Although with a judge so publicly in their favor, it seems that they saw a modest payment and lost sight of the general picture. But can we blame them? These are people who have been badly paid all their lives, to whom they have taken opportunities at the last moment, and to whom the UFC has sold them a lie after a lie after a lie. Perhaps the idea of finally beating them simply seemed too good to be true. It is blatantly obvious, thanks to the information revealed by this lawsuit, that the fighters are being financially harmed. We would not know that information in the coherent way in which we understand it if it were not for the advance of that lawsuit. And I said it last week. The debate has gone from, oh, well, they definitely don't pay them either, to, okay, they don't pay them either, and that's actually fine. People can argue that they like it or that they don't care about this fact. But this can be ruled out as ignorance or malice. The UFC has perfected the practice of preventing true journalists from covering the sport. And this means that fans are rarely aware of the scope and complexity of the problem. But it is mainly the UFC expelling, withdrawing credentials, and being absolutely hostile to the media that do not simply make public relations for them. However, there is still a ray of hope that a legal intervention can force the UFC to pay a higher percentage of income to its squad. But that's all, a ray. With the fighters divided, journalism dead, and the market closed, it is unlikely that the fragile structure of the UFC will collapse in the short term.